Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for a pretty intense philosophical journey.
Definitely high altitude thinking today.
Right. We're not really discussing what might be true about the universe. Instead, we're looking at what must be logically true about the starting point, the absolute foundation of any argument about the universe.
Yeah, the absolute bedrock.
Our source material for this is, well, it's this incredibly rigorous logical exchange, a formal investigation, really. It systematically tested every major challenge to one single foundational idea.
Like intellectual high stakes poker, as you said.
Exactly. Every attempt to knock down this premise just got dismantled by pure logic. So our mission today is a bit different. We're starting at the end, at the final, maybe astonishing conclusion, and working backward to see which arguments just couldn't stand up to that scrutiny.
That's right. And the stakes here are, well, they couldn't be higher, could they? If you're building any kind of worldview, scientific, spiritual, whatever, and you want it to actually hold water, to be logically sound, non-self-refuting,
Yeah.
it has to follow this rule. Otherwise, the whole thing's built on sand. It'll eventually collapse under its own weight. We're identifying that necessary logical precondition, the single non-negotiable starting point for all coherent philosophy.
Okay, let's dive in then, starting right at the finish line. The final conclusion that survived this logical gauntlet. What is it? What's the necessary foundation all philosophy must rest on?
Okay, the ultimate conclusion they reached is this. Any coherent, non-self-refuting worldview has to be built on a foundation that is, and this is the key phrase, semantically compatible with the concept of divinity.
Whoa, okay, that's a big term, divinity. Especially if we're aiming for something universally applicable. I mean, if I'm a secular thinker, I hear that, and my first reaction might be, nope, not for me.
Right, and that's a fair reaction initially, but it's crucial to understand this isn't a theological claim. It's not about pushing God or any specific religion.
So what does it mean then, in practical, logical terms?
It's really about the required logical characteristics of that starting point. For something to work as a true, unshakable foundation and axiom, the concept itself has to embody perfect, unified, context-free integrity.
Perfect. Unified. Context-free. Isn't defining your starting point as perfect, kind of? Well, begging the question, how is that logically solid?
But it directly addresses the problem of infinite regress. Think about it. If your starting point, your core axiom, is flawed or imperfect.
Then you have to ask where the flaw came from.
Precisely. Where did the imperfection originate? And then what caused that? You immediately get stuck in this endless chain of causes, dependencies, contingencies.
Why going down forever?
To actually stop that infinite loop, to establish a real bedrock, the foundation must, by logical necessity, be perfect, non-contingent, unified. It has to contain its own explanation, essentially.
So like building a skyscraper, you can't have an infinitely deep foundation. At some point, you have to declare that the very first block is perfect and supports itself. Otherwise, the whole thing is floating.
That's a great analogy. That absolute need for a perfect, unified, axiomatic concept that's the bedrock. It's the universal requirement to avoid logical collapse right from the start. Unity and perfection aren't optional extras, they're mandatory.
Okay, so unity and perfection are the required conclusion. Let's work backwards now. What was the biggest challenge that tried to break this idea? The source mentioned radical dualism as a major one. How did they try to argue against this necessary unity?
Right. The dualists, their approach was aggressive. They argued that reality isn't fundamentally unified, but defined by eternal conflict and inherent tension.
How did they try to make that work axiomatically?
They tried to break the concept of a single perfect axiom by proposing two perfect opposing axioms, things like absolute form versus absolute formlessness, or maybe order versus chaos.
So the idea was that existence itself is this constant, unresolvable battle, that tension is the foundation, not some underlying unity.
Exactly. Conflict is the starting point. But the sources, they called this a logical parlor trick, a serious error even.
Strong words. Why did starting with conflict fail so dramatically from a logical standpoint?
Because conflict inherently requires two existing things, two actual terms, to clash. You can't logically sustain a fundamental opposition between a thing like form or order or being and its literal absence, a non-thing like formlessness, chaos, or unbeing.
Ah, okay. So the structure of the argument itself falls apart.
It does. It tries to give equal fundamental status to a concept and its logical negation, its absence. Think about it. You can't have a real battle where one side is defined simply as not existing at all.
It needs something to conflict with.
Precisely. Conflict, by its very definition, can only happen within a system that already has some kind of unified structure allowing for interaction. So the claim that conflict itself is the fundamental axiom is logically self-falsifying.
So the conclusion was that dualism relies on an illusion of fundamental opposition.
Yes, that conflict must be a projection, something that appears within an already unified perfect system, not the foundation of that system.
So the foundation must be unity, logically inescapable.
That's what the analysis concluded, yes.
Okay, that brings us to the next major challenge then. This one came from scientific naturalism. They weren't pushing for conflict, were they? They were trying to replace divinity, that perfect qualitative idea, with something else.
Right. They aim for a structural axiom, something based on observation. Concepts like causality or maybe the inherent intelligibility of the universe.
So this was a clash between two types of axioms.
Essentially, yes. The qualitative axiom, which says the essence of being is perfection, versus the structural axiom, saying the structure of being is knowable order, like cause and effect.
The naturalist wanted something empirical, measurable, derived from the world itself to be the ultimate starting point, like physical law or causality.
That was the core of their argument. Could physical law or causality stand up as that necessary, context-free, perfect starting point?
And the sources argue. No, they refuted this, saying the structural axiom just doesn't pass the test for being a perfect starting point. Why? I mean, causality feels pretty solid. Why is that a worse axiom than perfection, which sounds, well, abstract?
Because causality and physical law are fundamentally contingent. They're derived. Well, the technical term is a posteriori.
A posteriori, meaning?
Meaning known from experience,
Yeah.
after the fact. Yeah. We only figure out physical laws after we observe the world, right?
Yeah, we watch things happen, measure them, then describe the pattern.
Exactly. Newton didn't just know gravity worked that way. He observed apples, planets, whatever, and then described the law. Then Einstein came along, observed more, and refined or even replaced parts of that law.
Okay, I see. A law that can change, that's kind of messy, that depends on what we happen to observe, that can't logically be the unchanging absolute foundation of everything.
Precisely. It's a result of interacting with reality, not the ultimate starting point before reality. If your foundation is contingent, it means it depends on reality being a certain way.
But if it depends on reality, it can't be truly foundational. It's putting the cart before the horse, logically speaking.
Right. And this is where that unicorn analogy the sources use becomes really helpful. It highlights the confusion between the perfection of a definition and the truth of a proposition about reality.
Okay, let's hear the analogy. How does a unicorn help here?
Okay, think about a perfect unicorn. We can define it. By definition, a perfect unicorn is, say, a beautiful horned horse with every positive quality imaginable. That definition, the concept itself, is perfect in its own terms. It's a tautology. It is what it's defined to be, logically sound as a definition.
Right. The definition is internally consistent, perfect by its own rules.
That definitional perfection is what the qualitative axiom, divinity is perfect, relies on. It's setting up a perfect concept as the starting point. Now compare that to the naturalist trying to use physical law as the axiom.
Physical law isn't just a definition, it's a statement about the world, a proposition.
Exactly. It's contingent. It's based on observation. It's like saying the perfect unicorn exists in the physical world. That's a proposition you have to test, and it might be false. Physical laws are like that they are propositions about how reality behaves, and they can be refined or proven incomplete.
So using physical law as your axiom is like trying to build your entire logical system on the assumption that perfect unicorns definitely exist out there. You're confusing the neatness of the concept with the messy reality it's supposed to describe.
You've got it. The illusion is projecting conceptual perfection onto a necessarily imperfect provisional map of reality, which is what our current understanding of physical laws always is.
Okay, so how did this resolve the conflict in the source material?
Well, the synthesis was that the structural axiom ultimately fails because it's just a less developed rebranding, as they put it, of the qualitative one. The naturalists' physical laws aren't the real axiom.
They're the results.
They're the provisional, ever-changing results you get when you apply a deeper, prior unifying faith, an axiom that the universe is fundamentally an ordered, intelligible system in the first place.
So even the most rigorous scientist, when they assume the universe is understandable through consistent laws, they're actually applying an unprovable axiom.
Yes. The axiom that the underlying system must possess that perfect integrity in order for their experiments and laws to even make sense or be repeatable.
And that assumed perfect integrity.
Exactly.
that's semantically compatible with divinity.
Logically speaking, yes. It functions in the same way as the qualitative axiom.
Yeah.
They end up arguing over the label, not the logical necessity of a perfect unified starting point.
Wow. Okay. So we've established this logical necessity. You must start with a perfect axiom of unity. But there's still a catch, right? A universal constraint that applies no matter which label you use for that starting point.
That's right. Even once you accept the need for a perfect axiom, there's this profound, non-debatable truth about the limits of our knowledge.
This is where we get into the impossibility of creating a perfect model of reality. The idea that we, as finite minds, can never fully map the whole system.
Exactly. Reality cannot be fully modeled. You can think of it like Gödel's incompleteness theorems applied more broadly. A system like the human mind, which is inside a larger system, reality or manifestation, cannot create a perfect 1.1 totally complete and non-contradictory map of that parent system.
We can't step outside the universe to observe the whole thing objectively.
We simply can't. So any worldview claiming a perfect, complete model is possible would be inherently flawed.
But here, scientific naturalism actually has a solid response, doesn't it? They don't claim perfection is possible.
Correct. The logical error identified wasn't that naturalism attempts the impossible, but that it's sometimes accused of it. A sophisticated naturalist doesn't claim a perfect final map is achievable.
What's the goal then?
The goal is to create progressively more accurate and useful models based on evidence. They generally accept this fundamental limitation, this universal boundary, and this limitation, this unavoidable boundary on what any finite mind can know or model.
Mm-hmm.
That's the great equalizer here. It applies to everyone.
How so?
It proves why both worldviews, the one using the divinity language and the one using the physical law language, must ultimately rely on an unprovable axiom, an extrapolation from the known to the unknown whole.
Can you give an example of how that plays out for both sides?
Sure. Think about physics. You can't empirically prove that the laws you observe here on Earth work exactly the same way inside a black hole or at the very edge of the universe or before the Big Bang. You observe a part.
And you extrapolate. You assume the underlying order holds true everywhere.
You assume the perfect integrity of the whole system? Yes. So the secular naturalist might say, look, I can never fully model the entire material system, but I can keep improving my model with evidence, assuming the underlying order persists.
And the other side?
The spiritual pantheist, using different language for that same perfect axiom, might say, I can never fully comprehend or model the divine consciousness, but I can strive to improve my alignment with it, trusting in its underlying perfection. Both are extrapolating from an unprovable perfect axiom.
Both relying on faith in that fundamental perfect integrity, just described differently.
That's the implication.
Okay, this has been, well, definitely a deep dive. We've navigated some very complex logical territory. So wrapping this up, what's the core practical takeaway for you, the listener, trying to build or refine your own understanding of the world?
I think the key takeaway is this. You now know the absolute logical requirement for any truly sound philosophical argument. Any system, any worldview that tries to start with fundamental conflict or with inherent imperfection or with something contingent and derived like observed physical laws, it's built on logically shaky ground.
It won't stand up to rigorous self-examination.
Ultimately, no. Your foundation, logically speaking, must be unified and perfect. That's the price of coherence.
And the sources offered one last really profound knowledge nugget based on this. If your necessary starting point is an axiom of perfection and unity,
Things like imperfection, failure, suffering, conflict. They can only be understood as illusory and impossible when viewed from the perspective of that fundamental perfect axiom.
meaning they aren't fundamentally real, but more like localized distortions, misunderstandings of the perfect whole.
That's one way to interpret it, yes. Imperfection becomes a feature of the limited perspective, not the underlying reality.
Which leaves us with our final provocative thought for you to chew on.
Given that we've established through this rigorous logical process that the necessary starting point for any coherent worldview must be a perfect axiom of unified integrity, does the real difference between seemingly opposing worldviews, say spiritual versus secular, truly lie in their fundamental substance?
Or is the difference maybe just in the language they choose? Different words, different metaphors used to describe the very same logically necessary, ultimately unprovable, perfect starting point.
Something to think about.